Telltale's Back to the Future the game is or was a graphic adventure game, similar to Telltale Games' other work. I say was because you can't exactly buy the game on digital stores anymore, or at least the legit ones. The game was delisted a few years back around the same time Telltale was shut down, which is a shame because Back to the Future the game is an underrated gem that everyone needs to experience at least once. While it's not a masterpiece or anything mind-blowing by any means, it's a wacky and genuinely enjoyable game that is greatly underappreciated. I mean, who doesn't want more Back to the Future? It's part of Telltale's classic, much older catalog. The catalog which was before The Walking Dead and alongside Sam and Max. This was before Telltale went full on cinematic in later games, as Back to the Future still contains a heavy amount of point-and-click exploration, which is a little less present in more recent Telltale games. You can see just by how filled the HUD is compared to something like The Wolf Among Us or Tales from the Borderlands, that this game prioritized gameplay a little more than cutscenes. In this video, I'll be covering the first episode subtitled It's About Time. Now, why didn't I just do all 5 episodes in one video? Well, because unlike newer Telltale games which have an hour-and-a-half-ish episodes, Back to the Future's episodes are 2+ hours each with a lot of content in just one episode. And also, I don't want to spend any more time delaying these videos as I already have. I mean, this video was supposed to come out nearly, 7 months ago? Now that that's out of the way, shall we begin? And before we start, this video is going to be filled to the brim with spoilers. In fact, the first segment is me basically giving an in-depth summary of the plot. If you want to skip anything plot related, I advise you to skip to the near end of this segment or skip this segment entirely. You have been warned. I would like to say first and foremost that this is not a Back to the Future 4 in a video game form. In fact, this is like a spin-off to the main story, since it feels like its own game with its own wacky narrative. Now yes, the beginning of the game basically has you replay an event that happened in the films, but they are altered for the sake of the plot or overall narrative. The way the narrative is structured and how it connects to the overall franchise feels fresh. It introduces new characters in a colorful and rather wacky fashion. It kind of reminds me of some kind of old Adult Swim animation, and expect me to say that many times over. Also, before we begin with the plot, you're gonna have to mind my South African accent when it comes to these names. For example, for you guys it's Marty and Doc, for me it's Marty and Doc, so excuse me. After waking up from a nightmare that relives the events of the first movie with a twist relevant to the game's plot, Marty finds out that Doc's belongings are being sold to the bank due to Doc being absent for quite a long time, about 6 months to be exact. Marty then encounters the DeLorean, or the time machine, or whatever you want to call it, outside the house. In the DeLorean is good old Einie, alongside a shoe from the past. It dates back to 1931. So, Marty goes back in time. While in June 13th, 1931, Marty finds out that Doc was arrested. Doc was accused of burning down a speakeasy, so you need to get him out. After encountering Doc through a jail window, he tells us to find his younger self and needs to deliver a subpoena to Marty's soon-to-be grandfather, Arthur Artie McFly. Artie works for Kit Tannen, Biff's younger equivalent. So when Artie tried to convince Kit Tannen to let Doc alive, Artie was set to be killed the next day. Marty and Doc then travel back a bit in time to fix up a few things and basically settle on trying to avoid their past selves. And that marks episode 1's story. I honestly think it's well written and pretty entertaining. I feel like the narrative structure is solid and works for this game. It mixes elements from a strictly plot-driven story along with elements from a mostly character-driven story. The goal is rather straightforward, but the last minute twists near the end work pretty damn near perfectly. I honestly don't really have much bad things to say about episode 1's overall narrative, and I feel it's pretty solid. The length does overstay its welcome a little bit, but the characters fit what's going on and the themes, and it was enjoyable from start to finish. If you've played any other Telltale game, you more or less know how this game plays. It's interactive, it's choice driven, and you need to investigate some things. Although I do have to say, for a Telltale game, Back to the Future's level design is quite open-ended, such as when you go back in time to the small township, which includes Kitan and Speakeasy. You can explore the place almost quite freely, especially in episode 2, which we'll get to. And while being open-ended, there's times where you have to do at least 2 or more objectives in the same time period, like a small subplot or mini storyline or side mission, if you will. I like this a lot, as it requires you to use a mini subplot to help you progress through the main plot. Think of it as a narrative puzzle that you need to piece together, where you choose a subplot that contains an item or a character that can help you progress through the main objective. But then at the same time, you also have this overarching secondary storyline, which is for another time. But unlike Telltale's later games, Back to the Future doesn't exactly have that model of certain or different actions impacting how the story is gonna go. For example, there isn't any alternate endings in this game at all. It's basically one linear narrative with additional choices that are basically there for alternate ways of completing an objective and fleshing out characters. I see this as a good thing because alternate endings in a Back to the Future story could make things very complicated very fast and require some absolute genius writing. Even so, with all the time travel and alternate actions, that could possibly break the space-time continuum in a matter of minutes, and all of this would make your head spin. As nostalgic and exciting as this game's presentation is, it is far from perfect. Well, you see, the thing is, as talented as they are in storytelling and writing, overall presentation as a final game usually comes out a little rough. Early works of theirs are affected by this quite a bit. Awkward and sometimes game-breaking animations, inconsistent and sometimes game-breaking performance, buggy visuals, and buggy dialogue. They have always been rough around the edges, and Back to the Future is unfortunately no different. The game lags every time a new speaker is about to say their lines. Skipping a few lines sometimes results in overlapping and sometimes looped or repeated lines of dialogue, which isn't exactly a pleasure to listen to.
We'll take it from...
But other than that, it's like watching a classic Adult Swim animation that maybe takes itself a little bit seriously. Back to the Future the game is a fun little Telltale game that for some reason didn't get as much recognition as it should have and as it deserved. It's one of the few movie-based game adaptations that is actually really good because the game's design is unique and fits the genre of the Back to the Future name. It feels like playing through a TV animation from the mid-2000s, and I can't help but fall in love with it. It's charming and it feels like playing through a time capsule. Coincidence? I think not. Now unfortunately, not everything in the game holds up. Most importantly, some of the animations and the way the dialogue is programmed. Overall presentation. Like I mentioned before, dialogue lags are a pain to listen to, and some of the animations are really rough around the edges. This game accurately shows where Telltale came from before making more cinematic film-like games, such as The Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us. If you're coming from their later games and you revisit Back to the Future or Sam and Max, you're definitely gonna feel the age of these games. But you're gonna realize some really innovative features from these games that are missing from the more recent catalog. To me, Back to the Future is an absolute underrated hidden gem.
Great Scott!